Hi, my name's John Spanton. I'm the Technical Education Director at Trevor Sorbie in Covent Garden in London. We're here today with Hairtribe TV, filming some different techniques. This is my model Katie. We are working on a pre-lightened base that's just been toned to a clean blonde. So we're going to use a hair weft, something we're not doing every day in the salon certainly, but we do use for shoots and shows. Just to kind of give you a little bit more creative freedom really. So we're going to bring Katie back a little bit later on and you'll see the finish technique actually applied onto the hair. So one of the things that's really important when you're working with wefts is preparation. Buying white wefts is usually really expensive and they're quite difficult to find to begin with anyway. So I tend to buy like a light golden blonde and then I pre-lighten it myself. So usually what I do with that is it's 20 minutes, 20 volume with a lightener, and then you tone it. But you have to be very careful toning it because they tend to be really quite porous. And the best way I've found to tone with is using a violet-based shampoo. I pre-mix it with maybe about 100 ml of water, and I then put that into a basin full of water, and then dip the pre-lightened wefts into that. And you might be dipping it in for 30 seconds, it could be 3 or 4 minutes, and you just have to watch it like you would any toner. And just watch it till it cleans out. And what you really want to look for is something that's just becoming slightly silvery. Because as soon as you rinse that off and then condition it, you'll find that silvery will slightly slip and you'll get much more of a cleaner blonde. So what we've got here is a pre-prepared weft. I use these little coat hangers when I'm travelling around with wefts because it means I can get a lot of preparation done before I arrive. So they're coloured, they're dried, they're ironed, and they're kind of more or less ready to go without too much effort. Then the next thing is how you prepare it on for painting. So I use these foam-backed mood boards. You can buy them in any art supply store. They're usually £1.50, £2. So not a huge amount of money. They can be reused, but we've obviously got new ones today so that you can see a nice clean end result in the colour. So I've got one, very children's TV already prepared on the board. Now once you've got it on the board, I use staples to attach it to the board because it's the most secure way I've found of attaching it to the board. One of the things that I've used tape and it can slip a little bit. I've tried other things, I've used weft glue, again it can slip a little bit, but staples tend to keep it quite secure and keep it exactly in place. Then once you've got that done, using not too strong a hairspray because you don't want to put any sort of barrier on for the colour, but literally spraying down so that you don't move the hair around. Just follow with your hand to slightly smooth any little stray hairs because we're going to do fairly simple work, but fairly intricate work, and you don't want any little stray hairs catching, or as few as you possibly can. So what I'm going to do is use the back end of a tint brush. I've cut the end off it slightly so that I've got a little bit of a flatter round end, and then I'm just using a little bit of a bright colour. So we're going to go in with the blue, and I tend to shake it slightly so that you end up with a little bit of colour in the pot lid, and then that becomes your palette that you work from. So the good thing about that is that you've kind of got a little kind of pot that's quite manageable from the size of your hand, and then you can start working with it and you can hold it at the same time. Now we're going to create just a sort of a line across the hair, and then we're going to start to soften out that line with some dot work. The reason that I was sort of drawn to this sort of as an idea when I first started to try it was in the last few years balayage has become incredibly important in the industry. We're doing lots of freehand painted work, and the terminology hair painting kind of became more and more popular, and then I thought, well, what about actually painting hair? And one of the techniques I remember from school was a thing called pointillism. The pointillism is a series of dots that form together with a great artist, who will create maybe an image of a face or an image of a scene or whatever. And I'm not that much of an artist, so I'm not going to create any sort of Rembrandt pictures for you, but it's more of a feeling of density of colour, softening off to sort of lighter and more of a blended feel to the colour, so we can sort of create shapes within shapes, if you like. So I'm just about to start with the dot work here, and all I've got is this little brush, and I'm just sort of dipping it into the lid that's sort of filled with colour. Using a little light pressure with my hand, just to kind of give me a little bit of a guide for the line, and just to sort of stop any little stray hairs from picking up as I'm working. And all I'm going to do is I'm going to keep it simple, and just using the edge of the brush to sort of create a fairly straight line with the dots. So you can see, because it's not absorbent, the end of the brush, you do have to sort of dip in to the colour fairly often. And what I find I do in certain areas is kind of choose to go in light so that I can go back in slightly heavier once I'm happy with it. Now, I'm working at a slightly odd angle here. If I was doing this at home, which is where I tend to do a lot of my preparation, I would be a little bit more face on to the board. So if I do end up slightly off on the line, you'll just need to forgive me. But it's fairly easy, it's a visual thing. I don't like to use masking tape and so on, because it tends to give almost a fake straight line. And the other thing that is important to remember is that I'm putting a straight line on a straight, flat surface. Then it's going to be applied onto a head, and the head's not a straight, flat surface. So the line that I create now will create a line within the hair, but it's not going to remain straight. It's going to begin to curve. It'll curve down the way towards the back, and it'll curve down the way towards the front. So if you do want to try and create a straight line on the head, you really need to curve up at either end, so that you can sort of get a straight line when it's actually applied onto the head. Now, this length of weft will generally give you a fairly even distribution of colour throughout the whole of the top of the head. I always make them slightly longer, just to sort of allow for a slightly larger head, but also just to allow me to adjust any kind of little edges to give me a cleaner finish to the bottom. So once you've kind of got your line in, you're sort of fairly happy. If you do need to adjust, so it's maybe slightly higher on this side, you can just go back in and bring that line slightly further down, because we're going to start to work up the way. And then from this sort of thing, I tend to like to work from the middle out, just because it gives me a bit more of a balanced amount of colour. So all I'm doing, trying to keep using the flat end of the brush, so that you get clearly defined dots. And then it's just an element, a matter of creating a shape that you want, or an amount of blend that you want. So I appreciate that watching this repeatedly might not be the most interesting thing, so I'll work through fairly quickly, and I'll keep this pattern that we're working on here fairly simple, so that you get the idea. And a little while later, we're going to show you a couple of techniques that I've pre-done, so that you can kind of see different effects. And I've kept them quite simple, but I've used one with this same shade, and I've actually done two lines where we're sort of blending out with a gap in the middle that meets around the middle of the back of the head, so that you kind of come from a central point, and then you sort of focus out into two lines on either side. And then the other one, I have used a black root, and then dotted out from that black root, and then I've used a red, and I've sort of tried to create a little bit of a firefly shape, sort of elongated through the front area, and then blended up from that. So the dots kind of blend out in the middle somewhere. So you can see, by working from the middle, you get the opportunity to kind of try and get something sort of fairly similar on both sides, If this is going to work around the head, you can either choose to create something that is kind of more asymmetric, or you can do something that's fairly similar. But it's a slightly random thing. And one of the things that I find very useful for checking if you are looking for something slightly more balanced is just to kind of cross your eyes ever so slightly and squint at the board so that you get a general feeling for the density of colour across the way. And that kind of just gives you a bit of a feeling for it as you're working. So now that we've kind of got that in, I'm going to make that line slightly more dense so that we've kind of got a little bit of a kind of real heavy looking coloured area. Now, as we said, this is going to sit on the roundness of a head, and what will happen is, because it's not a very dense weft, what will happen is you'll start to see bits of the pre-lightened hair from Katie sort of peeking through that, so it's going to break up that line slightly and soften it. So always make your line slightly more dense than you think you might want it. So now that I've made that slightly more dense, I think that's probably enough for me. I'm then going to start to spread the dots out slightly further. Now again, it's fairly random. There's no right or no wrong. I'm a firm believer that once I kind of speak about the work that I do publicly, it's kind of then not really my technique anymore. It's kind of yours, and we kind of share it. So what is good about that is that I kind of want people, if they like the idea and they want to try it, to kind of make it theirs and make it better and kind of do different colours, different density of pigment in different areas. Because once it's kind of out there, it's not really just mine anymore, is it? And I think that kind of sharing of techniques is really important. So you can see I'm kind of really spreading these out now, and it's fairly random. And again, as I said, kind of using that, just slightly squinting your eyes just to check that you're happy with the density of pigment and the hair, that you're going to see if it's something that you're happy with. Now, working in blonde wefts is always the easiest option. I always quite like to try and do things that I don't like and make them likeable. So one of the things that I've done with the red that you'll see shortly is red and blonde hair for me looks really cheap and quite nasty a lot of the time. So it's not really one of my favourite things as a colourist. So it's kind of creating something that works. So the technique helps with that, but the other thing is creating quite a dark red. So the red that I use is quite a bright, glaring red, but I add just a little bit of black into that so that it makes it more like a sort of deep blood red. And that for me starts to work slightly better when you're working on pre-lightened hair, and it just makes it slightly less cheap looking, which I think that sort of red or blonde can so easily be if you're not too careful. So all I'm doing now is just kind of defining, so I'm going to sort of stop more or less there, but what I want to do is just kind of check that the dots that I've got are kind of heavy enough, because as I said, the hair will move and it will split. So what you're going to get is something that's too soft might just disappear a little bit. Now, as you can see, the hair splits slightly, and for me, just from a balance point of view, I will still dot the board just so that I feel that I've kind of got an even balance of colour across the head, so that when I am checking it, that it begins, or sort of not begins to work, but continues to work as a technique. So we'll stop there as far as the colour is concerned. What I would do next, if I was doing preparations as I did for these, I would leave that to dry for at least a day, maybe a day and a half, and you really want it to be completely dry. We're not going to wash this out. As soon as you wash that out, it'll begin to smear, so you'll lose the definition in the dots and you'll start to tint slightly the the other hair. So if you can't leave this overnight or for at least a day, day and a half, the only other option is to dry the colour in. Now obviously because it's slightly wet, if you were drying it here, you would start to spread the colour potentially, so you'd lose a little bit of definition. So it's low and slow really is the best option, kind of high heat, slow speed, and just literally sit with your diffuser. But I would probably recommend you want to be at least about sort of 45 minutes, maybe an hour, so it's crispy dry. And at that point then you can start to comb it through. If you start to comb it through before you get it completely dry, again you will smudge the colour. So the dryness of it is really important. But as I say, we're not going to rinse it out. This is meant for something for fun, for a shoot, for a seminar. It's not meant for something that the client can kind of go home with it in her hair and wash repeatedly, because the colour will change and it will soften and begin to get a little bit blurry. So the important thing is that you get it dry. So what we're going to do now, we're going to bring back Katie. We'll show you the first of the two looks that we've got ready for you for today. One will be a similar feeling to this, and the other one, again, slightly more of an edge. We've got a black root painted in there, so you can see a little bit of a kind of different feeling from it as well, which I think is quite cool. Okay, so this is the first of the two looks that we spoke about earlier on, using the blue instant colour. As you can see, it's been dried on, it's been brushed through, and then we've applied the weft with a little bit of weft glue, just sort of dotting it through to make it fairly simple to take back off. But if we can just turn Katie towards the side, you can start to see the effect. So as the hair moves, it splits and you start to see her hair through it, and it kind of softens the line, but it gives you a sort of feeling of density where we've coloured slightly heavier, and then sort of breaking off into sort of smaller sort of sections of colour, which is a little bit more delicate. And if we can just turn Katie to face the back, you can sort of get the full effect. So as the hair moves, it splits and the colour changes ever so slightly depending on how the hair's laying flatter. And then we can just turn you back round to the front again. So I hope you like the first look. Then we'll bring back next one. It's slightly stronger. We've gone for a black and a red. So you'll see the second look in a second. Okay, so this is the second of the two looks. Slightly different this time in that what we've done is we've started with a black line. We've blended out slightly and then sort of begun the dot work softening off. And then we've created a red line through the bottom, similar to a firefly shape, and then softened up. So if we can just turn to the side, you can just see that almost creates a shape within the hair, slightly at odds with the rest of the hair. We've just carried that round into a nice sort of soft roundness, and then sort of back up on the other side, back into sort of the angled, slightly longer firefly shape. What we've done is we've actually applied the weft right onto the parting this time, and we've used just a little bit of a coloured dry shampoo to kind of fake it. So although it looks, for me, slightly wiggy, I kind of like that effect. We're not pretending this is real hair. What we're doing is kind of just showing you an idea. And it kind of gives you a bit of more of an edge because you've got the black root painted in there too. I hope you like that too.